The summer sky darkened without warning over Nora Sullivan's homestead as she frantically gathered the laundry from the line, the wind already tugging at the sheets with greedy fingers. By the time the first drops of rain pelted her face, she knew this was no ordinary storm. The horizon had disappeared beneath a churning wall of black clouds, and the air hummed with an eerie freight train roar that made her blood run cold. Nora had survived 3 years alone on her California homestead after her father's passing, but nothing had prepared her for the twister that descended that fateful afternoon in 1873. As she huddled beneath the root cellar door, clutching her father's pocket watch and her mother's Bible, the world above her disintegrated into splinters and dust. The following morning revealed a devastation so complete it stole her breath away. Her modest home, built by her father's hands, the only place she'd known since coming west as a child, was nothing but scattered timber and broken dreams. The barn where she'd kept her 2 milk cows and riding horse lay flattened, its contents strewn across what remained of her wheat field. Even the sturdy oak that had shaded her porch through blazing summers was uprooted, its massive trunk snapped like a twig. Nora stood motionless among the ruins, her chestnut hair whipping around her face in the aftermath breeze. At 23, she had weathered her share of hardships: her mother's death from fever, her father's struggle to create something from nothing in this wild land, and finally, learning to manage alone after he joined her mother in the hereafter. But this was a breaking point that threatened to crush her spirit entirely. "Miss, you hurt." The deep voice startled her from behind, and she turned to find a tall stranger on horseback regarding her with concern. His hat was pulled low, but she could see the shadow of several days' worth of beard on his sun-weathered face. "I'm unharmed," Nora managed, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. "More than I can say for everything else." The stranger dismounted with fluid grace that spoke of years in the saddle. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair and penetrating eyes that assessed the destruction with a practiced gaze. "Name's Tucker Hayes," he offered, extending a calloused hand. "Was riding through when I saw the twister touch down yesterday. Came back to check for survivors." Nora accepted his handshake briefly. "Nora Sullivan, this was my homestead." The past tense caught in her throat. Tucker surveyed the wreckage again, then looked at her with unexpected determination. "Well, Miss Sullivan, it still is your homestead. Land's still here. Rest can be rebuilt," she laughed bitterly. "By whom? I haven't the funds to hire builders, and winter will be here before I know it." "I reckon I could lend a hand," he said simply, as if offering to help carry a package rather than rebuild an entire life. Nora studied him properly, then the worn but quality saddle on his horse, the reliable-looking pistol at his hip, the straightforward gaze that held no hint of deceit she could detect. In the Wild West, strangers were often dangerous, but sometimes they were salvation. The question was determining which stood before her now. "Why would you do that, Mr. Hayes? You don't know me." Tucker replaced his hat, adjusting it thoughtfully. "My pa always said a man's measured by what he does when nobody's watching and what he offers when there's nothing in it for him." He gestured toward the devastation. "Besides, I've got skills that could help, and nowhere pressing to be." Nora wasn't accustomed to charity, nor did she particularly want it. Pride had sustained her through many hardships, but pride wouldn't rebuild her home or plant her fields. She weighed her options quickly. There weren't many. "I can't pay you," she stated flatly. "Wasn't asking for payment," Tucker replied, "though I wouldn't turn down a meal now and then. You're suggesting you'll rebuild an entire homestead for occasional meals." The corner of his mouth quirked slightly. "I'm suggesting I'll help you rebuild your homestead because it's the right thing to do. The meals would just be a welcome bonus." "Are you running from something, Mr. Hayes?" Nora asked bluntly. "Because I won't harbor a fugitive." "Nothing like that," he assured her. "Just a man between destinations who's got two hands that know how to work." Nora glanced at the foundation of her home, the only part that remained intact, and then at the vast work that rebuilding would require. She'd never make it alone. "There's a tent in the root cellar," she decided. "You can pitch it by what's left of the barn. We'll start at first light tomorrow." Tucker nodded once, understanding the decision had cost her something in pride. "First light it is." He turned to retrieve his saddlebags, then paused. "Miss Sullivan, that twister took your home, but it didn't take your homestead. Long as you've got the land beneath your feet, you've got a chance." Nora watched him walk his horse toward the ruined barn, wondering if she'd just made a terrible mistake or been granted an unexpected blessing. Either way, tomorrow would begin the task of rebuilding what the wind had so violently torn away. True to his word, Tucker Hayes was already assessing the foundation when Nora emerged from her makeshift shelter in the root cellar the next morning. Dawn painted the sky in hushed pinks and golds, a stark contrast to the destruction it illuminated. "Foundation solid," he announced without preamble. "That's good fortune. We'll need to salvage what lumber we can and make a trip into Calistoga for the rest." "I have some savings," Nora offered reluctantly. "Not much, but perhaps enough for essential supplies." Tucker nodded, already sorting through the debris. "First things first, we need a proper inventory. What you had, what survived, what needs replacing." He glanced at her worn dress. "You've got other clothes. A few things I managed to pull from the wreckage yesterday." "Good. This isn't work for a dress." He returned to examining the scattered timbers, testing each for soundness. Nora bristled slightly at being instructed on proper attire, but she couldn't deny the practicality of his assessment. She retreated to the root cellar and changed into her single pair of work trousers, scandalous by town standards, but essential for ranch work, and a simple cotton shirt that had belonged to her father. When she emerged, Tucker raised an eyebrow but offered no comment. They worked systematically through the morning, separating salvageable materials from debris. Tucker's expertise became quickly apparent in the way he examined each beam and board, explaining why certain pieces could be reused and others couldn't. By midday, they had created organized piles and a rudimentary list of what they'd need to purchase. "I'll need to see about the livestock," Nora said during their brief rest for water. "My horse and the cows might have survived if they broke free." "Already looked," Tucker replied, wiping his brow. "Found your horse about a quarter-mile east, sheltering in a gully. Seems sound, just spooked. No sign of the cows yet." Relief flooded her. "Copper's alive, thank goodness. Brought him back this morning while you were still sleeping, tied him near my mount." He gestured toward where two horses grazed on the sparse grass beyond the destroyed barn. "You didn't think to tell me this sooner?" Nora couldn't keep the irritation from her voice. Tucker looked genuinely confused. "Figured you'd see him when you were ready to notice. Been a bit busy otherwise." His matter-of-fact response diffused her annoyance. Of course, she'd been too preoccupied with the immediate disaster to look beyond it. "Thank you for finding him. He was my father's horse." Tucker nodded, understanding the significance without further explanation. "We should head into town tomorrow, get those supplies. Today we'll finish clearing and see what else might be salvageable further out." The remainder of the day passed in exhausting labor. Nora discovered muscles she didn't know she possessed as they cleared debris and expanded their search for scattered belongings. Tucker worked tirelessly, never complaining, occasionally offering quiet advice but mostly respecting her capability to work alongside him. By sunset, they had recovered more than she dared hope: kitchen implements buried under collapsed walls, her father's toolbox wedged miraculously intact beneath a fallen beam. Even her mother's rocking chair, damaged but reparable, found nearly 50 yards from the house. As darkness fell, Tucker built a small fire near their temporary shelters. Nora contributed the last of her preserved food, some dried beef and beans which she prepared in her recovered cast iron pot. They ate in companionable silence, the exhaustion of the day settling into their bones. "Why are you really helping me, Mr. Hayes?" Nora finally asked, studying him across the flickering flames. Tucker considered her question, his expression thoughtful. "Told you before it's the right thing." Most men in these parts have a more selective view of right things when it involves weeks of unpaid labor. He poked at the fire, sending sparks dancing upward. "Maybe I've seen enough wrong to recognize right when it's needed." After a moment, he added, "Lost my own home once. Not to a twister, but to men who wanted our land. Nobody came to help us rebuild. Always figured if I ever had the chance to be the help I wished for then, I would." The simple sincerity in his voice convinced Nora more than any elaborate explanation could have. She nodded, accepting his answer, and they lapsed back into silence as the stars emerged above them. "We'll head out at first light," Tucker said finally, rising to his feet. "Get some rest, Miss Sullivan. Tomorrow's the first real step toward getting your life back." Nora watched him retreat to his tent, wondering about the man who had appeared from nowhere to help rebuild what nature had destroyed. Despite her natural caution, she found herself grateful for his presence and curious about what had shaped him into someone who would stop for a stranger's tragedy. The journey into Calistoga the next morning revealed further evidence of the twister's path. Downed trees and scattered debris marked its capricious route through the countryside. Other homesteads had been luckier than Nora's, suffering only minor damage or being missed entirely by the narrow band of destruction. "Nature's strange that way," Tucker commented as they rode past a farm where one barn stood untouched while another lay in ruins. "Two buildings side by side takes one, leaves the other. Like fate playing dice with people's lives," Nora agreed, adjusting her bonnet against the morning sun. When they reached Calistoga, the small but bustling town was already alive with activity. The mercantile's porch hosted the usual collection of old-timers exchanging news and speculation, while farm wagons and riders moved purposefully down the main street. Their arrival did not go unnoticed. Nora was well known in town, and the news of her homestead's destruction had clearly preceded them. As they hitched their horses outside Jameson's mercantile, several townspeople approached with expressions of concern. "Miss Sullivan, we heard about your place, Mrs." Jameson exclaimed, hurrying from the store. "Herbert rode out yesterday but said you weren't there." "I was searching for salvageable items," Nora explained, accepting the older woman's sympathetic embrace. Mrs. Jameson stepped back, finally noticing Tucker. Her eyebrows rose questioningly. "This is Mr. Hayes," Nora introduced. "He's helping me rebuild." The woman's expression shifted subtly as she assessed Tucker with newfound interest. "Is that so? Well, that's mighty generous of you, Mr. Hayes." Tucker tipped his hat respectfully. "Just lending a hand where it's needed, madam." More townspeople gathered, offering condolences and questions. Nora noticed the speculative glances between Tucker and herself, but chose to ignore them. Small towns thrived on gossip, and a single woman accepting help from an unknown man would certainly fuel conversation. She had more pressing concerns than wagging tongues. Inside the mercantile, Mr. Jameson, a portly man with a businessman's shrewd eyes, listened to their needs with increasing dismay. "Lumber's going to be a problem, Miss Sullivan. That twister wasn't the only one that hit." Got 3 other families needing building materials, and the sawmill's already backed up with orders. We need to get at least the basic structure up before the weather turns, Tucker said. There must be something available. Jameson scratched his chin thoughtfully. Well, old man Peterson's been sitting on seasoned timber he cut last year. Might be willing to part with some, though he'll charge a premium. Where can we find him? Nora asked. Homestead's about 5 miles north of yours. Can't miss it, got those distinctive red barns. Tucker nodded. We'll see him today. In the meantime, we'll take whatever nails, tools, and supplies you can provide. As they compiled their purchases, Nora calculated costs with growing concern. Even with her modest savings, the expense of rebuilding would stretch her resources dangerously thin. Problem? Tucker asked quietly, noticing her expression as she counted coins from her purse. Just realizing how little goes how short a distance, she murmured. When Jameson tallied their purchases, the total confirmed her fears. She was about to reluctantly remove several items when Tucker placed additional coins on the counter. Should cover it, he said firmly. Mr. Hayes, Nora began to protest. Consider it an investment in the project, he interrupted. Can't build properly without proper materials. His tone brooked no argument, and Nora recognized the futility of objecting in front of Jameson. She nodded curtly, promising herself to address the matter later. As they loaded their purchases onto Copper and Tucker's horse, Sheriff Wilson approached, his weathered face serious beneath his badge. Miss Sullivan, heard about your trouble. You doing all right? Managing, Sheriff, thank you. The lawman's attention shifted to Tucker. Don't believe I've had the pleasure, Mr. Hayes, Tucker Hayes. He extended his hand, which the sheriff shook with professional assessment. Passing through our county, Mr. Hayes, helping Miss Sullivan rebuild her place. The sheriff's eyes narrowed slightly. That's so, mighty neighborly for a stranger. He turned back to Nora. You vouching for this fella, Miss Sullivan? The question carried weight beyond simple curiosity, and Nora understood the sheriff's concern. Single women were vulnerable in the territories, and unknown men often brought trouble. Mr. Hayes has been nothing but helpful and respectful, Sheriff, she answered firmly. I'm fortunate he was nearby when the twister hit. Wilson seemed satisfied, if not entirely convinced. Well, just know my office is open if you need anything. We look after our own in Calistoga. Appreciate the vigilance, Sheriff, Tucker said easily. Good to know Miss Sullivan has folks watching out for her interests. After the sheriff departed, they secured the last of their purchases and mounted up. As they rode out of town, Nora could feel curious eyes following them. Sheriff seems protective, Tucker observed once they were on the open road. He and my father were friends, Nora explained. Since Pa died, he's kept an eye on me when he can. Good man doing his job, Tucker acknowledged. Right to be suspicious of strangers. Are you? A stranger to these parts, I mean. Tucker adjusted his hat against the sun. Passed through years back. Country's changed some since then. And where do you call home now? He was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. Been riding circuit long enough that home's a flexible concept, he finally said. Last few years, worked ranches from Texas to Montana. Lately been doing odd jobs in California. So you truly are between destinations, as you put it. Tucker smiled slightly. Honest advertising. They rode in silence for a while before Nora spoke again. I can't accept your money, Mr. Hayes. Your labor is already more charity than I'm comfortable with. Not charity, he corrected. Partnership of sorts. You need help, I need. He trailed off, seeming to search for the right words. What do you need, Mr. Hayes? The question hung between them, layered with meaning neither was ready to explore. Purpose, maybe, he finally said. And as for the money, consider it a loan if it sits better with you. You can repay it when your farm's producing again." Nora wanted to refuse, but recognized the practicality of his offer. "Very well. A loan with proper interest." Tucker's lips quirked into a hint of amusement. "We can negotiate terms once we've got a roof over your head." They reached Peterson's homestead by mid-afternoon. The old farmer, a grizzled man with suspicious eyes, listened to their situation with limited sympathy. "Timber's worth more than it was last month," he declared, leading them to his stacked lumber. "Demand's up with all this storm damage." "We understand market forces, Mr. Peterson," Nora replied diplomatically. "But surely there's a fair price that acknowledges both your investment and our need." What followed was a negotiation that revealed Nora's unexpected skill at bargaining. Tucker watched with growing admiration as she methodically addressed each of Peterson's inflated claims, countering with knowledge of current lumber prices and careful appeals to neighborly fairness. By the end, they'd secured enough timber for the basic structure at a price that, while still dear, wouldn't bankrupt them entirely. "Didn't know I was riding with such a formidable negotiator," Tucker commented as they arranged for Peterson's son to deliver the lumber the following day. "My father taught me never to accept the first offer," Nora replied, "and never to let being a woman make me an easy target for overcharging." "Wise man, your father." "He was." A shadow of grief passed across her face. "He would have hated seeing the homestead destroyed. Built every inch of it himself, just like I imagine we're about to do." Tucker studied her with newfound respect. "You don't strike me as someone who's afraid of hard work." "I'm not," she affirmed. "I'm just not accustomed to accepting help." "Everyone needs help sometimes, Miss Sullivan. Trick is knowing when to accept it and when to give it back." As they rode home in the fading light, Nora contemplated the strange turn her life had taken. A week ago, she'd been an independent woman managing her modest homestead alone. Now she was homeless, dependent on a stranger's generosity, facing months of backbreaking labor to reclaim what the twister had stolen in minutes. Yet oddly, despite everything, she didn't feel defeated. There was something about Tucker Hayes's steady presence and matter-of-fact approach to the enormous task ahead that kindled hope where despair might otherwise have taken root. When they returned to the homestead, the reality of their situation reasserted itself. Their campsite looked pitifully small against the expansive destruction surrounding it. Tomorrow, they would begin the actual rebuilding, turning plans into physical progress. For now, however, they were still two people making the best of a desperate situation. Tucker built the evening fire while Nora prepared a simple meal from their new supplies. As darkness settled around them, he surprised her by pulling a harmonica from his pocket. The sweet, melancholy notes drifted across their campsite, somehow making the night less lonely. "That's beautiful," Nora said when he finished. "Where did you learn to play?" "My mother taught me," he replied, turning the small instrument in his hands. Said music was a portable comfort that could never be taken away. "She sounds wise." Tucker nodded, his expression distant. "She was. Raised 4 boys mostly on her own after my father died in the war. Taught us all to be useful, to work hard, and to remember that kindness isn't weakness." "And your brothers? Where are they now?" "2 have ranches in Colorado. One didn't make it past 20, caught in a flash flood while moving cattle." His voice held old grief, long accepted but never forgotten. "I'm sorry," Nora said softly. Tucker slipped the harmonica back into his pocket. "Life out here takes as often as it gives. You know that better than most." She nodded, thinking of her own losses. "Yet we persist." "That we do, Miss Sullivan." He raised his coffee cup in a small toast. "That we do." The arrival of Peterson's lumber wagon the next morning marked the true beginning of reconstruction. Tucker had spent the previous evening sketching rough plans, incorporating Nora's descriptions of her original home while suggesting practical improvements. "Foundation suggests your house was about 24 by 16, he noted as they began to work. "Solid size for one person, though we could expand slightly if you wanted." "The original dimensions served me well enough," Nora replied, helping him measure and mark, "though perhaps the kitchen could be somewhat larger." "Woman after my own heart," Tucker grinned. Nothing worse than a cramped cooking space. They fell into a natural rhythm of work, with Tucker handling the heavier construction tasks while Nora assisted and managed the smaller details. His experience quickly became evident in the efficient way he approached each phase of the rebuild, wasting neither materials nor effort. By sunset, they had set the first floor joists and laid the subfloor for half the house. Remarkable progress that left Nora both exhausted and exhilarated. "At this rate, we might have walls up within a week," she marveled as they collapsed by the fire. Tucker nodded, flexing his shoulders to ease tired muscles. "Weather holds, we could have you under a proper roof before month's end. Won't be finished inside, mind you, but it'll keep the elements out." "That's more than I dared hope yesterday." The following days established their working pattern. They rose at dawn, worked until the light failed, taking breaks only when absolutely necessary. Tucker proved to be not just skilled but also patient, explaining each step of the process and teaching Nora techniques that would serve her long after the house was complete. "Never know when you'll need to fix something yourself," he reasoned when she questioned why he bothered explaining a particularly complex joint connection. "Knowledge weighs nothing to carry." A week into construction, with the framework of the walls now standing like a skeleton against the sky, unexpected visitors arrived. Sheriff Wilson rode up with 3 other men from town, all bringing tools and offers of assistance. "Figured you could use some extra hands," the sheriff explained. These boys volunteered for a day's work. The additional help accelerated their progress dramatically. By sundown, all the exterior walls were framed and braced, and the roof structure was beginning to take shape. As the volunteers prepared to leave, Sheriff Wilson pulled Nora aside. "Hayes seems to know his business," he acknowledged. "Still, if you have any concerns—" "I don't," Nora assured him. "Mr. Hayes has been nothing but respectful and hardworking. I'm fortunate he's willing to help." The sheriff nodded, though his expression remained thoughtful. "Just unusual, a man investing this much effort with no clear benefit to himself." "Perhaps not all benefits are visible, Sheriff," Nora suggested. "And not all men act solely from self-interest." After the townsman departed, Tucker approached with 2 cups of coffee. Sheriff still suspicious. "Protective," Nora corrected, accepting the steaming cup. "Though I assured him you've given me no reason for concern." "Appreciate the character reference," he said with a slight smile. "Made good progress today. Tomorrow we can start on the roof." "I've been thinking," Nora began hesitantly. "The original house had just the 1 bedroom, but with the adjustments we've made to the layout, there's space for 2. It would be practical." Tucker raised an eyebrow. "Practical for guests," she explained quickly. "Or if I were to hire help in the future. A homestead this size really requires more than 1 pair of hands to run properly." He nodded slowly. "Makes sense. We can frame it in tomorrow after we get the roof started." That night, lying in her tent with the partially constructed house visible through the open flap, Nora found herself contemplating the future with cautious optimism. The destruction that had seemed so absolute was gradually being reversed through hard work and unexpected kindness. And though she was reluctant to admit it even to herself, Tucker Hayes's presence had become more than just practical assistance. It had become a comfort she would miss when the work was done. The next morning brought unwelcome change to their established routine. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon as they began work, and by mid-morning, the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. "We need to get the tarpaulins over the frame," Tucker called, already moving toward their supplies. "Can't let the new lumber get soaked." They worked frantically to cover the exposed framework, securing heavy canvas over the structure as the rain intensified. The downpour soon became torrential, forcing them to abandon the effort and seek shelter in the root cellar. Huddled in the small space, dripping wet and frustrated by the interruption, they listened to the rain hammering against the cellar doors above them. "Could be worse," Tucker observed, wringing water from his hat. "At least we got most of it covered." Nora sighed, pushing wet hair from her face. "I should be grateful it's only rain after what the twister did, but every delay feels like a setback I can't afford." "Rebuilding isn't just about speed," Tucker said, lighting the small lantern they kept in the cellar. "It's about doing it right so it lasts." The warm glow illuminated their cramped shelter, casting soft light on the preserved food jars Nora had managed to save, and the few personal belongings she'd retrieved from the wreckage. "Tell me about your home before," Tucker suggested, settling against the earthen wall. "What made it special to you?" The question caught Nora by surprise. Most of their conversations had been practical, focused on the work at hand rather than memories or feelings. "It wasn't grand," she began slowly. "Just a simple farmhouse. But my father built it with such care, little touches that made it ours. The way the morning sun would hit the kitchen table just right for breakfast. The window seat in my bedroom where I could watch the seasons change. The porch where Pa would sit evenings, telling stories of places he'd been before settling here." As she spoke, the tension eased from her shoulders. "When he died, keeping the homestead going was my way of honoring him. Every harvest, every repair I managed myself, felt like proving his faith in me wasn't misplaced." Tucker listened attentively, his expression thoughtful. "We'll build those things back," he promised quietly. "Not exactly the same, can't replicate what's gone. But we'll make new spots for morning sun and evening stories." The sincerity in his voice touched something in Nora, a vulnerability she generally kept carefully guarded. "Why did you really stop, Mr. Hayes?" Most men would have ridden on, perhaps reported to the sheriff that there was a survivor, but nothing more. Tucker was silent for a long moment, the lantern light playing across his features. "When I saw that twister touch down, I remembered another storm years back. I was riding through Kansas, came upon a family whose farm had been hit. Parents dead, 3 young children somehow survived, no relatives nearby." He paused, the memory clearly difficult. "Took those kids to the nearest town, tried to find someone to take them in. Town was struggling already, nobody wanted 3 more mouths to feed. Ended up at an orphanage 2 counties over. Hated leaving them there, but I was just passing through, had nothing to offer them myself." Nora watched his face as he continued. "Rode away thinking about all the things I couldn't do for those children. When I saw your homestead destroyed, thought maybe this time I could actually help. Do something real instead of just feeling sorry about a situation." The honesty of his admission created a new understanding between them. This wasn't charity or even simply the right thing, it was a man seeking redemption for a past he couldn't change by changing what he could in the present. "Thank you for telling me," Nora said softly. "And thank you for staying." Tucker met her gaze, something unspoken passing between them before he nodded once and looked away. "Rain might let up by afternoon. We can assess any damage and get back to work." The storm continued through the day, forcing them to remain largely inactive. They used the time to refine their building plans and take inventory of their remaining supplies. By evening, the rain had diminished to a steady drizzle, and they ventured out to check the covered framework. "Held up well," Tucker announced after inspection. "Got some standing water to deal with, but the structure itself is sound." "Thank goodness for small mercies," Nora replied, surveying their surroundings in the fading light. The homestead had been transformed into a muddy expanse, with their campsite looking particularly forlorn. "Though I confess I'm growing weary of tent living." "Shouldn't be for much longer," Tucker assured her. "Weather clears, we can have the roof on within days." Despite his optimism, the rain continued intermittently for the next 3 days, turning the worksite into a challenging quagmire and significantly slowing their progress. They worked when they could, often in damp discomfort, and retreated to their separate shelters when the downpours intensified. On the 4th morning, Nora awoke to blessed silence, no pattering of raindrops on canvas. She emerged from her tent to find clear skies and Tucker already at work, clearing accumulated water from the covered structure. "Thought you might sleep a bit longer," he called when he spotted her. "Been a rough few days." "Too much to do," she replied, joining him. "And I've never been one to waste daylight." With renewed energy, they threw themselves into making up for lost time. The walls that had been mere frames now received exterior sheathing, and the roof structure was completed by midday. Tucker worked with impressive speed, his movements efficient and practiced, while Nora matched his pace as best she could, determined not to be the limiting factor in their progress. By sunset, the house had transformed from a skeleton to a recognizable structure still unfinished, but now offering promise of the shelter it would soon provide. "Another good day like today," Tucker observed as they sat by their evening fire, "and we might have you sleeping with a proper roof overhead by week's end." "Thanks to you," Nora acknowledged. "I couldn't have managed half this progress alone." Tucker shook his head. "You underestimate yourself, Miss Sullivan. Might have taken longer, but you'd have found a way. You've got grit." "Grit doesn't raise roof beams." "No, but it keeps you going when others would quit." He studied her across the flames. "Your father taught you well." The compliment warmed her more than she expected. "He did, though I'm still learning things he never had chance to teach." "Like what?" Nora considered the question. "Like how to accept help without feeling diminished by it, how to rebuild not just structures but expectations." "Hardest lessons often come without teachers," Tucker observed. "Just life throwing situations at you and seeing what you make of them." "Is that how you learned?" Nora asked. "From situations rather than teachers?" Tucker poked at the fire thoughtfully. "Had some of both. My mother taught values. My father taught skills what little time I had with him. Rest came from making mistakes and paying attention to consequences." As the evening deepened around them, their conversation drifted to lighter topics, funny incidents from Nora's childhood on the homestead, amusing characters Tucker had encountered in his travels. For the first time since the twister, Nora found herself laughing freely, the weight of disaster temporarily lifted by shared stories and the simple pleasure of human connection. When they finally retired to their respective shelters, Nora lay awake longer than usual, replaying their conversation and realizing how much she'd come to value Tucker's company beyond his practical assistance. His quiet strength and unfailing work ethic had been essential to the rebuilding effort, but it was his understated kindness and unexpected moments of wisdom that had helped rebuild her spirit alongside her home. The thought was both comforting and unsettling. Tucker Hayes was, by his own admission, a man who didn't stay in one place long. Once the house was complete, he would likely move on to whatever destination awaited him next. The homestead would stand as testament to his skill and generosity, but the man himself, would become another of the West's transient figures, remembered but absent. This recognition brought an unexpected pang of loss, premature, but nonetheless real. Nora pushed the feeling aside, reminding herself that practicality, not sentiment, was what would see her through the challenges ahead. The following week brought remarkable progress. With clear weather and their now well-established working rhythm, the house took shape rapidly. The roof was completed and shingled. Windows were framed and installed using the glass they'd managed to salvage, and exterior siding began to transform the structure into a proper home. Inside, interior walls defined the spaces Nora had described from memory and the improvements they'd agreed upon. Word of their project had spread through the surrounding area, and occasionally neighbors would stop by with small offerings, a basket of fresh bread, preserved fruits, even a handmade quilt for when you're back under a proper roof. Each gift was accompanied by admiration for the work they'd accomplished and thinly veiled curiosity about Tucker. "Folks certainly wonder about you," Nora commented one afternoon as they worked on interior walls. Mrs. Abernathy could barely contain her questions yesterday. Tucker smiled slightly as he measured a board for cutting. "Small towns run on two currencies, goods and gossip. What's the prevailing theory?" "Most common seems to be that you're a distant relative I never mentioned." "Plausible enough." "The more imaginative suggest you're a notorious outlaw hiding in plain sight, building my house as cover for some nefarious scheme." Tucker laughed outright at this, a rare full sound that transformed his usually reserved expression. "If I were planning something nefarious, I'd choose easier cover than building a house from scratch. That's what I told Sheriff Wilson when he hinted at similar concerns." Nora handed him the saw he'd requested. "Though I admit, you remain something of a mystery, Mr. Hayes." "Not much mystery to me," he replied, beginning his careful cut. "Just a man who's seen enough of the country to appreciate the value of putting down something permanent, even if I'm not the one to stay and enjoy it." The comment reminded Nora of the temporary nature of their arrangement, a fact she'd been increasingly successful at ignoring as they worked side by side day after day. Before she could respond, a distant whinny announced visitors. Two riders approached across the open field, a man and woman Nora recognized as the Hendersons, whose farm lay several miles to the south. Unlike previous visitors, they didn't bring gifts, but rather news. "Spotted smoke signals over the ridge yesterday," Mr. Henderson reported gravely after dismounting. "Apache, most likely. Thought you should know, being out here alone." "We're not exactly defenseless," Tucker replied evenly, his hand unconsciously moving closer to the pistol he kept nearby while working. "But I appreciate the warning. Any other reports of trouble?" "Nothing direct," Henderson said. "But Jacobs lost 2 horses last week," said the tracks headed south toward the reservation. Mrs. Henderson, a kindly woman with worried eyes, addressed Nora directly. "Perhaps you should consider staying in town until things settle, dear. This house is coming along beautifully, but it's still rather isolated." "This is my home," Nora replied firmly. "I won't abandon it because of unconfirmed concerns." The Hendersons exchanged glances that suggested they'd expected this response, but felt obligated to try. After extracting promises that Nora and Tucker would remain vigilant, they departed, leaving an undercurrent of tension in their wake. "What do you make of it?" Nora asked once they were alone. Tucker considered the question carefully. "Apache generally have reasons for movements off reservation land. Could be nothing to do with settlers, could be tribal matters, but caution's warranted either way." "I've never had trouble with the native people," Nora noted. "My father always maintained peaceful relations, traded fairly when the opportunity arose. Good policy, Tucker agreed. Still, situations change, and not all grievances involve specific individuals. Sometimes just being part of a larger group that's caused harm is enough. They returned to work, but the warning had cast a shadow over their previously light-hearted day. That evening, Tucker cleaned his firearms with particular attention and suggested they keep the horses closer to camp than usual. Precaution, not prediction, he explained when Nora questioned the measures. Been in enough territories to know preparation matters more than probability. 2 more days passed without incident. The house progressed to the point where interior finishing work had begun, laying floorboards, installing door frames, plastering walls. Tucker had constructed a simple but sturdy front door, complete with a proper lock he'd purchased on their second trip to Calistoga. Should be able to sleep inside by tomorrow night, he announced as they surveyed the day's work. Won't be pretty yet, but it'll be secure. Nora ran her hand along a newly plastered wall, marveling at how quickly destruction had given way to reconstruction. It's already more than I hoped for. Different from before, but somehow. Right. Tucker nodded, understanding what she meant without need for elaboration. The new house incorporated elements of her memories, but stood as its own creation, a synthesis of what had been and what could be. That night, their usual campfire conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of hoofbeats. Tucker rose immediately, hand moving to his holster as he scanned the darkness. "Stay by the fire," he instructed quietly. "I'll see who's coming." Before he could move far, Sheriff Wilson's voice called out from the darkness. "Miss Sullivan, Hayes, don't shoot, it's Wilson." The sheriff rode into the circle of firelight, his expression grave. "Glad to find you both alert. There's been trouble. Marshall's ranch was raided earlier today. Lost livestock and had a barn burned." "Apache?" Tucker asked. Wilson nodded. "Looks that way. No casualties, thankfully, but I'm advising all outlying homesteads to take precautions. Sent word to the fort requesting patrols, but it'll be days before they respond." "We appreciate the warning, Sheriff," Nora said. "We've been keeping watch since the Hendersons mentioned concerns." Wilson studied the nearly completed house. "Making remarkable progress here, but might be wise to consider town accommodations temporarily, Miss Sullivan." Before Nora could object, Tucker spoke. "House is secure enough now. Good sight lines in all directions, solid door and shutters. Might actually be safer here than moving across open country at this point." The sheriff considered this assessment, then nodded reluctantly. "Your choice, of course." "But I'd feel better knowing you're not out here alone, Miss Sullivan." "Mr. Hayes has proven himself quite capable," Nora replied. "I feel entirely safe in his company." Something in her tone caused both men to look at her with different expressions, the sheriff with slight surprise, Tucker with an unreadable intensity that made her heart beat faster. After the sheriff departed with renewed warnings to remain vigilant, an awkward silence fell between them. The acknowledgement of trust Nora had expressed so publicly seemed to have shifted something in their carefully maintained relationship. "Did you mean that?" Tucker finally asked, his voice unusually quiet. "About feeling safe with me," Nora met his gaze steadily. "I wouldn't have said it otherwise. You've given me no reason to doubt your character or capabilities." He nodded once, seeming to absorb her words carefully. "We should turn in. Tomorrow's another full day." That night, Nora lay awake longer than usual, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the prairie darkness with new awareness. The twister had reminded her how quickly security could be stripped away by forces beyond control. Now human threats potentially added another layer of vulnerability to her already precarious situation. Yet strangely, despite these concerns, she didn't feel afraid. The house taking shape around her homestead represented more than shelter. It had become a symbol of resilience and unexpected connection. And the man who slept in the nearby tent, whose skilled hands had transformed wreckage into home, had somehow become essential to her sense of possibility. With this realization came another, more unsettling one. Tucker Hayes would eventually leave. The house would be completed, his self-appointed task fulfilled, and he would ride on to whatever destination awaited him next. The thought created an ache Nora hadn't anticipated when she'd accepted his help weeks ago. Morning brought renewed focus on immediate tasks. As promised, Tucker completed enough of the interior work that moving inside became possible. They transported Nora's salvaged belongings and the new essentials they'd purchased into the house, creating a modest but functional living space. Not quite finished, Tucker noted as they stood in the main room, but definitely habitable. You'll sleep with a proper roof tonight. Nora turned slowly, taking in the fruits of their labor. The house was similar in size to her original home, but improved in countless small ways: better window placement for natural light, more efficient kitchen layout, sturdier construction throughout. Though still lacking final touches, it already felt like a place where life could flourish again. "We did this," she said softly, the plural pronoun significant, "from nothing but splinters and determination." "Mostly your determination," Tucker corrected. "I just provided the know-how." "You provided far more than that," Nora replied, turning to face him directly. "You gave me back my future when it could have been washed away with everything else." The intensity of her gratitude seemed to discomfort him. Anyone would have helped, but they didn't. You did. Nora stepped closer, suddenly needing him to understand what his presence had meant. "When that twister hit, I lost more than buildings. I lost my sense of possibility. You restored that alongside these walls and roof." Tucker's expression softened in a way she'd rarely seen, the habitual reserve giving way to something more vulnerable. Before he could respond, however, the sound of approaching horses shattered the moment. Moving instantly to alertness, Tucker motioned Nora away from the windows and retrieved his rifle from where it leaned against the wall. A quick glance outside revealed 3 riders approaching from the east, unfamiliar men who rode with the easy confidence of those accustomed to hard country. "Stay inside," Tucker instructed quietly. "I'll meet them." "This is my homestead," Nora objected, reaching for her own shotgun. "We'll meet them together." Something in her tone brooked no argument, and after a brief hesitation, Tucker nodded. They stepped onto the newly constructed porch as the riders drew near, their weapons visible but not aimed. The lead rider, a weather-beaten man with sharp eyes beneath a dusty hat, reined in at a respectful distance. "Afternoon," he called. "Looking for a man named Hayes. Told in town he might be found out this way." Tucker stepped forward slightly. "I'm Hayes. Something I can help you with." The man studied Tucker with open assessment. "Name's Garrett. These are my associates, Miller and Doyle. We represent certain interests that have been tracking a situation you might have knowledge about." "What kind of situation?" Tucker's voice remained neutral, but Nora noticed his stance had subtly shifted to one of readiness. "Matter concerning some missing items from a bank in Arizona territory." "Valuable items." Garrett's gaze flicked to the new house, then back to Tucker. "Interesting to find you settled in so domestically. Reports suggested you weren't the type to put down roots." "I'm helping Miss Sullivan rebuild after a twister took her home," Tucker replied evenly. "Nothing more complicated than that." Nora stepped forward. "Mr. Hayes has been here for weeks, working from dawn until dusk. Whatever you're implying is clearly mistaken." Garrett's expression didn't change, but his companions exchanged glances. "No implication intended, madam." Just following information. Perhaps we could speak privately, Hayes, clear up any confusion. The tension in the air was palpable. Tucker hesitated, then nodded. Miss Sullivan, would you mind giving us a few minutes? Reluctantly, Nora retreated to the house, though she remained near the window where she could observe the conversation. She couldn't hear their words, but the body language spoke volumes. Garrett doing most of the talking, Tucker responding with increasing tension evident in his posture. After what seemed an eternity, the riders tipped their hats and departed, though not before Garrett cast another long look at the house. Tucker remained motionless, watching until they were well away before returning inside. What was that about? Nora demanded as soon as the door closed behind him. Tucker ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of discomfort. Complication from the past, nothing for you to worry about. Those men clearly weren't making a social call, Mr. Hayes. If there's trouble coming to my homestead, I deserve to know its nature. He met her gaze directly. They're bounty hunters, tracking a man they believe was involved in a bank robbery in Prescott last year. They have incorrect information suggesting I might know something about it. And do you? Nora asked quietly. No, Tucker answered without hesitation. I was nowhere near Prescott when that robbery happened, but a man I once rode with apparently was, and since we were known associates years back, they're following that connection. Did you convince them of your innocence? Tucker's expression was grim. Bounty hunters aren't particularly interested in innocence, just rewards. I told them what I know, which is nothing useful to them. Hopefully that's the end of it. But his tone suggested he expected otherwise, and Nora felt a chill of apprehension. Just when her life was beginning to reform from chaos, new complications threatened the fragile stability they'd built. Will they return? She asked. Possibly, Tucker admitted. Men like that don't abandon potential leads easily, but their interest is in information, not confrontation. They have no cause to threaten you. It's not myself I'm concerned about, Nora replied. If they believe harassing you will produce results, they may not be easily discouraged. Tucker's expression softened slightly. I appreciate your concern, Miss Sullivan. But I've navigated complicated situations before. This one will resolve itself once they verify my whereabouts during the period in question. Though his explanation was plausible, Nora sensed he was withholding something, not necessarily about the robbery itself, but about the connection that had drawn these men to him. It was a stark reminder of how little she truly knew about the man who had become so central to her rebuilding efforts. That evening, as they shared their first meal inside the new house, a subtle tension lingered between them. Tucker seemed distracted, his usual quiet attentiveness replaced by periods of preoccupation. Nora found herself studying him with new awareness, wondering about the life he'd led before arriving at her devastated homestead. You're staring, Tucker finally observed, setting down his coffee cup. I'm wondering, Nora corrected, about the parts of your life you haven't shared. He met her gaze steadily. Most people have chapters they don't read aloud. True enough, but most people haven't spent weeks rebuilding my home while potentially being hunted by bounty hunters. Tucker sighed, conceding her point. What do you want to know? The truth about why those men are really looking for you. He was silent for a long moment, seemingly weighing his words carefully. The man they're tracking, the one connected to the robbery, is my brother Daniel, youngest of the four of us, always had a talent for finding trouble. The admission surprised Nora. Tucker had mentioned his brothers before, but never suggested any were on the wrong side of the law. I haven't seen Daniel in nearly 2 years, Tucker continued. Last time was in Colorado, where I tried to convince him to settle down, work our brother's ranch. He wasn't interested. When I heard about the Prescott robbery, I suspected he might be involved. his style, his timing. And you didn't report this suspicion. Tucker's expression hardened slightly. He's my brother. Misguided, reckless, even criminal at times, but blood nonetheless. I won't lead hunters to his door, even if I don't condone his choices. Nora absorbed this information, understanding both the loyalty it represented and the complication it created. These men believe you know where to find him. They hope I do, Tucker corrected. It's a reasonable assumption, given our history. But the truth is, Daniel stopped sharing his whereabouts with any of us years ago, said it was safer for everyone that way. You believe he committed the robbery they described? Tucker's hesitation was answer enough before he spoke. Probably. It fits his pattern: clever planning, minimal violence, maximum reward. He's not a killer, just a thief with expensive tastes and poor judgment. And these bounty hunters won't easily accept that you don't know his location. No, Tucker agreed. They won't. Which means they'll likely return, hoping to catch me in a moment of brotherly weakness. The implication hung heavily between them. Tucker's presence, which had been Nora's salvation after the twister, now potentially brought danger to her rebuilding homestead. Yet the house around them stood as testament to his character, his willingness to help a stranger in need, to work tirelessly without expectation of reward, to create something lasting from destruction. "What will you do?" Nora asked quietly. Tucker studied his hands, capable hands that had transformed lumber and nails into shelter over these past weeks. "Finish what I started here. See your house completed proper. Then move on, draw their attention away from your homestead." The practical logic of his plan was undeniable, but it struck Nora with unexpected force. Of course, he would leave. That had always been the understanding. Yet somewhere during their shared labor and evening conversations, she'd begun to imagine alternatives, possibilities that now seemed to be dissolving before they could fully form. Unless. Tucker began, then stopped himself. "Unless," Nora prompted. He shook his head slightly. "Nothing. Just thinking aloud." The conversation shifted to safer topics: the next day's work, the interior details yet to be completed, whether the kitchen shelving should be adjusted. But an awareness had awakened that couldn't be easily dismissed. Their partnership, born of disaster and sustained through dedicated work, now faced threats from multiple directions. Tucker's complicated past, the potential dangers reported by the sheriff, and the inevitable conclusion of their shared project. That night, sleeping for the first time in her new house, Nora found herself listening to unfamiliar creaks and settlings with a mixture of pride and melancholy. The home taking shape around her represented both tremendous achievement and impending loss. It would shelter her future, but the man who had made it possible would soon be part of her past. The following days brought steady progress on the remaining work. Interior walls were completed, floors finished, kitchen made functional with the installation of the salvaged stove. Tucker built simple but sturdy furniture to replace what had been destroyed: a table, chairs, bed frames, storage cabinets. Each piece reflected his careful craftsmanship, designed to last for years. They saw no sign of the bounty hunters, though Tucker maintained a more vigilant watch than before. The sheriff rode by twice, reporting no further incidents with the Apache but urging continued caution. Life settled into a rhythm of productive work, punctuated by increasingly comfortable evenings in the nearly completed house. As the final major tasks neared completion, an unspoken tension grew between them. Neither mentioned Tucker's eventual departure directly, but it informed their interactions: a hesitation before making plans more than a day ahead, careful avoidance of discussions about the future. One evening, as they sat on the new porch watching the sunset paint the prairie in gold and crimson, Nora finally broached the subject they'd been avoiding. "How much longer do you think until the house is truly finished?" she asked, keeping her tone deliberately casual. Tucker considered the question with his usual thoroughness. Main structures done. Interiors functional. Few more days of detail work, window trim, final touches on the porch railings, storm shutters for winter. Week at most, working at our current pace. A week. The timeline hung between them, significant beyond mere construction scheduling. "And then," Nora pressed gently. Tucker was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "And then you'll have your homestead back, secure and improved, ready for whatever future you choose to build in it." "That wasn't my question." He turned to look at her then, his expression unguarded in a way she'd rarely seen. "I've never stayed anywhere long, Miss Sullivan, not since I was a boy. Always another horizon, another job, another reason to move on. Is that what you want?" Nora asked, her heart beating faster despite her attempt at detachment. "Another horizon. One isn't always the governing factor in life's choices," Tucker replied. "Sometimes circumstances dictate direction more than desire. You're speaking of the bounty hunters," he nodded. "Their presence complicates things. As long as they believe I might lead them to Daniel, they'll keep watching. Staying here puts your homestead in their sights." "So you'll leave to protect me," Nora concluded, unable to keep a hint of frustration from her voice. "Making decisions about my safety without consulting my opinions on the matter." Tucker looked surprised at her response. "It's not about making decisions for you. It's about preventing my problems from becoming yours." "Did it occur to you that perhaps I should have some say in what problems I'm willing to accept?" Nora challenged. "That maybe I've formed my own opinions about what and who is worth the complications they might bring." The implication of her words hung in the evening air between them. Tucker studied her with an intensity that made her both nervous and resolute. "Nora," he said finally, the use of her first name marking a significant shift, "what exactly are you suggesting?" She took a deep breath, knowing that once spoken, certain words couldn't be retracted. "I'm suggesting that perhaps there are reasons to consider staying that might outweigh reasons to leave. Such as, the homestead needs more than one person to run properly," she began with practical considerations. "The fields, the livestock I hope to replace, the maintenance of all you've built, it's too much for one person alone." Tucker waited, clearly sensing there was more. And Nora continued, her voice growing quieter but more certain, "I've come to value more than just your skills with hammer and saw. Your company, your perspective, your steadiness in the face of challenges, these have become important to me." Tucker's expression remained unreadable, though something flickered in his eyes at her words. "That's a kind assessment of a drifter who happened to be passing through at the right time." "Is that all you believe you are? A drifter with convenient timing?" Nora shook her head in frustration. "You've rebuilt more than walls and roof, Tucker. You've helped restore my belief that destruction isn't the end of the story, that what comes after can be stronger, better designed, more purposeful than what was lost." Her use of his first name didn't go unnoticed. He stood abruptly, moving to the porch railing and gripping it as he stared out at the darkening land. "I'm not the settling kind," he said finally. "Never have been. The longest I've stayed anywhere in 15 years is right here, rebuilding your place, and that was different. Had a clear purpose, defined in point." "And if there were another purpose?" Nora asked, remaining seated, giving him the space his posture seemed to request. "One less defined, perhaps, but potentially more meaningful." Tucker turned back to face her, his expression troubled. "You don't know enough about me to make that offer, whatever its exact nature. Those bounty hunters are just one complication from a life full of them. I've made choices, some good, some questionable. ridden with men whose morals stretched thin at times. Never broke the law myself, but I've skirted edges that most settled folks would find concerning. Yet here you are, having spent weeks rebuilding a stranger's home for no reward beyond meals and the satisfaction of doing good, Nora pointed out. That speaks more clearly of your character than any past associations. It's not that simple. Perhaps it's simpler than you're willing to accept, she countered. Perhaps the man who stops to help when others ride past is the true Tucker Hayes, and the drifter is merely the shell you've been hiding in. Her words seemed to strike a chord, as Tucker's expression shifted from troubled to thoughtful. He returned to his seat beside her, close enough that she could sense the warmth of him in the cooling evening air. "You make compelling arguments, Miss Sullivan," he said finally, a hint of his rare smile touching his lips. "I thought we'd progress to first names," she replied, returning the smile. "Nora," he corrected himself. "You present an interesting alternative to my usual pattern, but the complications remain regardless of what either of us might wish." "Complications can be managed," she said. "What matters is whether they're outweighed by more important considerations." Tucker studied her with an intensity that made her heart race. "And what considerations might those be?" Nora gathered her courage, knowing she was stepping onto uncertain ground. The possibility that two people who found each other through disaster might discover something worth preserving beyond mere walls and roof. Something neither was looking for, but both might value more highly than expected. The directness of her suggestion hung in the air between them. In an era when women were expected to be passive recipients of male interest rather than active expressors of their own, Nora's words represented a bold departure from convention. Yet the unusual circumstances of their acquaintance perhaps justified equally unusual honesty. Tucker's response, when it finally came, was not in words but action. With careful deliberation, he reached across the space between them and took her hand in his. The contact was simple yet profound, a bridge across the careful distance they'd maintained throughout their weeks of working side by side. "I've been fighting an internal battle," he admitted quietly, "between what responsibility dictates and what I've increasingly wished might be possible. Telling myself that leaving was the honorable choice while knowing it would feel like abandoning something precious just as it began to take form." Nora's fingers tightened around his. "Then don't leave. Stay. We'll face whatever complications arise together, bounty hunters, Apache concerns, the challenges of making this land produce enough to sustain us. None seem insurmountable when approached as a shared burden rather than a solitary one." Tucker's other hand came up to gently touch her cheek, the calloused fingers surprisingly tender against her skin. "You should know what you're inviting, Nora. I'm not a man with resources or connections, just skills, experience, and a willingness to work hard for what matters. That may not be enough for the life you deserve." "I've never sought wealth or position," Nora replied softly. "Just honest partnership and the chance to build something meaningful. You've already demonstrated your capacity for both." The connection between them, built through shared labor and evening conversations, crystallized in that moment into something deeper and more deliberately chosen. Tucker leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to withdraw, and when she didn't, his lips met hers in a kiss that held both question and answer. When they finally drew apart, the last light of day had faded from the sky, leaving them in the gentle darkness of a prairie evening. Tucker's expression held a mixture of wonder and resolve that mirrored Nora's own feelings. "If I stay," he said quietly, "it would need to be properly, not just as a hired hand or friendly helper. I was raised to do things right." Nora understood his meaning immediately. I would expect nothing less. It wouldn't be easy, he cautioned. The homestead needs considerable work beyond the house itself. The fields need preparing, livestock replacing, and there's still the matter of Daniel and those hunting him. Life is rarely easy in these territories, Nora replied, but shared purpose makes difficulties more bearable. Tucker nodded slowly, seeming to come to a decision. Then, if you're certain, I'll ride into town tomorrow. Speak to the sheriff. Make my intentions clear so there's no misunderstanding about my reasons for remaining. And perhaps visit Reverend Collins to discuss arrangements for a ceremony, if that aligns with your thinking. The formal phrasing couldn't mask the emotion behind his words, and Nora felt a surge of joy that momentarily overwhelmed the practical considerations they'd need to address. That aligns perfectly with my thinking, Mr. Hayes. His smile at her deliberate return to formality was brighter than she'd yet seen. Well then, Miss Sullivan, it seems we have plans to make beyond finishing these window trimmings. The decision reached that evening transformed their final days of house construction. What had been efficient partnership became something richer, shared labor still, but now infused with the awareness that they were building not just a structure but a shared future within it. Their conversations expanded to include plans for fields and livestock, discussions of how the homestead might grow over time, even tentative dreams that reached beyond the immediate horizon. Tucker rode into town as promised, returning with news that surprised neither of them but confirmed the complexities they faced. Sheriff Wilson had received word that the bounty hunters remained in the area, making discreet inquiries about Tucker's movements and connections. More concerning, there had been another raid attributed to Apache parties, this time striking closer to Calistoga itself. Sheriff advised caution but said he'd keep watch on our road when possible, Tucker reported as they worked on installing the last of the kitchen shelving. Reverend Collins sends his regards and says Sunday next would suit him fine, if that timing works for us. Nora nodded, focusing on aligning the shelf properly to hide her flustered pleasure at this confirmation of their plans. Sunday is perfectly acceptable. Tucker smiled at her deliberate nonchalance. Figured as much. Also stopped by Peterson's place, arranged for some seedling fruit trees to be delivered next week. Apple, peach, and pear. Every proper homestead needs an orchard. The thoughtfulness of this long-term investment trees that would take years to bear significant fruit spoke volumes about his commitment to their shared future. Nora set down her tools and impulsively embraced him, propriety momentarily forgotten. "Thank you," she said simply, "for thinking beyond just rebuilding what was lost." Tucker's arms tightened around her briefly before he gently set her back to look at her with earnest intensity. "That's been the point all along, hasn't it? Not just replacing what the twister took, but creating something new that honors what was while embracing what could be." The parallels to their personal situation weren't lost on either of them. What had begun as disaster recovery had evolved into something neither had anticipated, a partnership founded on shared labor and resilience, growing toward a connection that promised to be stronger and more purposeful than either might have built alone. The following days passed in a productive blur. The house received its final touches, the last coat of paint on the porch rails, curtains hung at freshly trimmed windows, the new iron stove properly installed in the expanded kitchen. Tucker constructed a sturdy table for the main room, and a rocking chair reminiscent of the one Nora had described from memory. Each detail reflected their combined vision, marrying function with small touches of beauty that transformed mere shelter into home. Word of their upcoming wedding spread quickly through the surrounding homesteads. Neighbors who had offered sympathy after the twister now arrived with congratulations and practical gifts, preserved foods, household linens, even a young milk cow from the Hendersons, to start rebuilding your herd proper. The generosity was overwhelming to Nora, who had grown accustomed to self-reliance out of necessity rather than preference. "I hadn't realized how much this community values connection," she confessed to Tucker, as they arranged the latest offerings in their nearly completed home. "People respect resilience," he replied, setting down a heavy crate of canning jars gifted by a farmer's wife from beyond the ridge. "You could have given up after the twister, sold the land, moved to town or back east. Choosing to rebuild speaks to a spirit folks admire." "We rebuilt," Nora corrected gently. "I provided determination, but you provided everything else." Tucker shook his head. "Partnership from the start, even before we recognized it as such. Your vision, my hands, together we accomplished what neither could have managed alone." The sentiment captured exactly what had drawn them together, a complementary joining of strengths that created something greater than its individual components. It was this recognition that had transformed their working relationship into deeper connection, and which now promised to sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. Sunday dawned clear and mild, the prairie stretching vast and golden beneath a perfect blue sky. Nora stood at her bedroom window, watching the early light transform their newly rebuilt homestead. The house gleamed with fresh paint. The cleared yard showed signs of Tucker's careful planning for future gardens and outbuildings. And in the distance, the first tentative growth appeared in fields they had begun to reclaim from the twister's devastation. From disaster had come renewal, from destruction the opportunity to build something stronger. The parallels to her personal journey were unmistakable, and Nora found herself filled with a quiet certainty that had been absent from her life since long before the twister struck. The simple dress she wore, a gift from Mrs. Jameson, who insisted a bride needed something special regardless of circumstances, was modest but lovely, its soft blue fabric a deliberate departure from traditional white. "More practical for a homestead wedding," the older woman had declared, "and brings out the color in your eyes besides." A light knock at her door preceded Sheriff Wilson's voice. "Ready, Miss Sullivan? Folks are gathering." The sheriff had surprised her by offering to stand in place of her father, a gesture that had brought unexpected tears when he'd suggested it 2 days prior. "Be honored to escort you," he'd said gruffly. "Your pa would have wanted someone looking out for propriety, even in these unusual circumstances." Nora opened the door to find him uncomfortably resplendent in his Sunday best, hat clutched awkwardly in his hands. "You look lovely," he managed, the compliment clearly outside his usual conversational territory. "Thank you, Sheriff, and thank you again for doing this." He nodded, relaxing slightly. "Your father was a good man, helped me when I first came to this territory before I wore this badge. Least I can do is stand for him today." They stepped onto the porch to find that folks gathering had been a significant understatement. It seemed half of Calistoga and the surrounding homesteads had arrived, forming an impressive assemblage in the yard before the newly rebuilt house. Wagons and horses created a small village of conveyances at the edge of the property, while tables had been erected beneath a hastily constructed arbor, laden with food and drink for the celebration to follow. At the center of it all stood Tucker, nearly unrecognizable in clean, pressed clothes, his usual stubble replaced by a careful shave. Beside him, Reverend Collins waited with an open Bible and an expression of benevolent approval. As Nora descended the porch steps on Sheriff Wilson's arm, the assembled community fell silent, all eyes turning to watch her progress toward her future husband. The moment held a dreamlike quality. This same yard had been nothing but devastation mere weeks ago, and now it hosted a celebration of new beginnings. Tucker's expression, as she approached, contained everything she might have hoped for: admiration, certainly, but more importantly, a steady certainty that matched her own. This was no impulsive decision born of convenience or necessity, but a deliberate choice to build something lasting together. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful, with Reverend Collins speaking eloquently about foundations built on solid ground and houses that withstand storms, metaphors that resonated deeply with everyone present, who had witnessed the destruction and subsequent rebirth of the Sullivan homestead. When the time came to exchange vows, Tucker took Nora's hands in his with a gentleness that belied their strength. "I came to help rebuild what nature destroyed," he said, his voice clear and steady, never expecting to find something far more valuable in the process. "I pledge to continue building this home, this land, and the life we'll share within it with the same care and devotion I've tried to demonstrate these past weeks. What my hands can create, my heart can sustain, and both belong to you from this day forward." Nora's response came from equally deep conviction. "When the twister took everything I thought essential, it revealed what truly matters: not walls or roof, but purpose and connection. You helped me rebuild not just a house, but a future I couldn't have imagined alone. I pledge to face whatever storms may come with the same strength and faith that brought us to this moment, building together what neither could create separately." The simple gold bands they exchanged, purchased during Tucker's trip to town, symbolized promises more substantial than their modest appearance suggested. As Reverend Collins pronounced them husband and wife, the gathered community erupted in enthusiastic approval, the celebration beginning even before the final blessing was complete. What followed was unlike any wedding feast Nora had attended, a communal expression of support for a union that represented resilience and new beginnings. Children played in the yard where Tucker had first sorted debris. Neighbors who had contributed to the rebuilding exchanged stories of their involvement, and even Sheriff Wilson unbent enough to join in a toast to the couple's future prosperity. "Never seen a community rally like this," Tucker observed quietly as they accepted congratulations. "Speaks to how they value you." "Us," Nora corrected. "They're celebrating what we've accomplished together. The house is symbolic of possibilities, that destruction isn't the final word." As the afternoon progressed, Tucker occasionally scanned the horizon with habitual vigilance, a reminder that not all threats had been resolved by their marriage. The bounty hunters remained an unseen presence in the background of their celebration, and the reported Apache activities created an undercurrent of caution beneath the day's joy. Sheriff Wilson noticed these surveillance checks and approached during a quiet moment. "No sign of those men since you spoke with me," he reported. "But I've got deputies watching the main roads just in case, not having trouble disrupt this gathering." "Appreciate that," Tucker replied, "though I suspect they're biding their time rather than departing entirely." "Likely so," the sheriff agreed. "But they'll find this community less welcoming to their inquiries now that you're properly settled. Changes how folks perceive things when a man puts down roots." This observation captured an important truth about frontier society: transient individuals were viewed with inherent suspicion, while those who committed to place through property and family gained a presumption of character that strangers were denied. Tucker's marriage to Nora had transformed his status from drifter to settler in the community's eyes, creating a buffer of social protection neither had anticipated. As the celebration continued, an unexpected visitor arrived. Peterson, the taciturn timber seller, appeared with a wagon laden with young fruit tree saplings, not just the few Tucker had arranged to purchase, but a substantial collection that would create a significant orchard. "Wedding gift," the old man announced gruffly when Tucker expressed surprise at the quantity. "Figured you'd need more than 3 trees to make a proper showing. Got apple, pear, cherry, and some plum. Good varieties for this soil." The generosity from a man who had initially driven such a hard bargain for basic lumber left both Tucker and Nora momentarily speechless. "This is extraordinarily kind," Nora finally managed. Peterson shrugged uncomfortably. "Just good business. Man plants an orchard means he's planning to stay, tend it for years. Makes for stable neighbors, reliable trading. Self-interest, really." But the twinkle in his rheumy eyes suggested more complex motivations than mere commercial calculation. Like many frontier inhabitants, Peterson's gruff exterior concealed a deeper understanding of community interdependence. An investment in the Hayes-Sullivan homestead represented an investment in the region's future stability. As evening approached, the celebration began to wind down. Neighbors departed with warm wishes and promises of continued assistance with the ongoing work of fully restoring the homestead. Eventually, only Sheriff Wilson remained, helping to store leftover food and secure the borrowed tables. "Wanted a private word before I head back to town," he said once these tasks were complete. "Got a telegram yesterday I didn't mention earlier. Didn't want to cast shadows on the celebration." Tucker's expression grew alert. "About Daniel," the sheriff nodded. "Apprehended in Colorado last week. Apparently confessed to the Prescott job and several others." The news landed with complex impact. Relief that his brother was alive mingled with concern for his circumstances, and a certain vindication regarding Tucker's own uninvolvement. "Did he implicate anyone else?" Tucker asked. Specifically stated he acted alone in most cases, had different partners for others. "Your name wasn't mentioned." Wilson studied Tucker carefully. "Could have told those bounty hunters this information, sent them on their way. Chose to hold it until now, make sure your day wasn't disturbed." "Appreciate that consideration," Tucker said sincerely. "Figure those men will be moving on once word reaches them," the sheriff continued. "But if they cause any trouble before departing, you send word immediately. Consider this homestead under my jurisdiction's special attention." After the sheriff departed, Nora and Tucker stood together on the porch of their rebuilt home, watching darkness settle over the land that was now truly theirs in partnership. The days, events, the ceremony, community celebration, Peterson's generous gift, even the news about Daniel seemed to have solidified their position in ways neither had fully anticipated when they'd first agreed to join their futures. "Quite a day," Tucker observed, his arm around Nora's waist. "Not exactly how I imagined marriage would find me." "Disappointed?" Nora asked, leaning slightly into his solid presence. "Quite the opposite," he replied, turning to face her fully. "Everything about this place, the work we've done and still have to do, feels more right than anything in my wandering years." The simple honesty of his statement confirmed what Nora had increasingly sensed, that Tucker's rootless existence had not been a reflection of preference, but of circumstance, and perhaps a certain defensive caution. In helping rebuild her home, he had found the opportunity to build his own in the fullest sense of the word. "Come inside, Mr. Hayes," she said softly, taking his hand. "Let's properly begin this life we've been building toward." The house that had risen from destruction embraced them as they entered, the solid walls and sturdy roof representing not just physical shelter, but the tangible manifestation of shared purpose and unexpected connection. What the twister had torn away, Determination and partnership had replaced with something stronger, more deliberately crafted, and infinitely more valuable. 5 years later, the Hayes homestead stood as testament to resilience and steady growth. The house that Tucker had built with his own 2 hands now formed the center of a thriving small farm, surrounded by outbuildings constructed with the same careful attention to detail as the original structure. The orchard Peterson had gifted produced its first significant harvest that autumn, the young trees heavy with fruit that would see them through the coming winter. On the wide front porch where they had once discussed uncertain futures, Nora sat in the rocking chair Tucker had crafted for her 3rd anniversary gift, watching their 3-year-old son Thomas playing in the yard under his father's watchful eye. The boy's laughter carried clearly on the autumn breeze, as Tucker showed him how to gather the windfall apples into a small basket, a child-sized version of the ones Tucker had built for the harvest. Beside Nora, securely bundled against the cooling air, their 6-month-old daughter Hannah slept peacefully, untroubled by the activities around her. The infant's arrival had coincided almost to the day with the completion of the new barn events Tucker had declared equally monumental constructions, though one considerably more miraculous than the other. As she watched her husband and son working together among the apple trees, Nora reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought them to this moment. The twister that had seemed an ending had instead been a beginning violent and unwelcome, certainly, but ultimately the catalyst for everything that now gave her life its deepest meaning. Tucker glanced up, catching her gaze across the yard. Even now, after years of marriage and shared labor, that connection sent warmth through her that had nothing to do with the autumn sunshine. He said something to Thomas, then made his way toward the porch while the boy continued his important work of filling his small basket. "Productive harvest manager you've got there," Nora observed as Tucker climbed the steps and joined her. "Takes after his mother, determined to complete any task he starts," Tucker replied, smiling as he glanced at their sleeping daughter. "This one's still resting, finally. I think she's going to be the stubborn one. With our combined determination in her blood, I'd be surprised if she weren't." Tucker leaned against the porch railing, surveying their homestead with quiet satisfaction. "Sheriff Wilson's stopping by later. Says he has news about those new railroad negotiations." The potential extension of rail service closer to Calistoga had been a topic of intense community discussion for months. Such development would significantly improve access to markets for local farmers and ranchers, though opinions varied on whether the associated changes would benefit the region in the longer term. "You think it will happen this time?" Nora asked. Tucker considered the question with his usual thoroughness. "Possibly. The territory's growing faster than anyone predicted 5 years ago. Progress has its own momentum." His philosophical tone made Nora smile. The man who had once described himself as between destinations had become one of the community's most thoughtful voices on matters of development and change, a transformation that paralleled his evolution from solitary drifter to committed family man and respected neighbor. Thomas abandoned his apple gathering and raced toward the porch, his small face alight with excitement. "Papa, found a big one." He proudly held up an apple of modest size but apparently significant importance in his estimation. "That's a fine specimen," Tucker agreed seriously, examining the fruit with exaggerated care. "Perfect for your mother's pie, I'd say." The boy beamed at this assessment before noticing his sleeping sister. He immediately lowered his voice to a theatrical whisper that was possibly louder than his normal speech. "Hannah's still sleeping. She's missing all the apples. She'll have plenty of harvests to help with." Nora assured him. For now, she needs her rest to grow big and strong like her brother. Satisfied with this explanation, Thomas returned to his important work, leaving his parents to share an affectionate glance at his retreating figure. Hard to believe there was nothing but scattered timber here 5 years ago, Tucker observed quietly. Sometimes feels like a different lifetime. It was, Nora replied, reaching for his hand. For both of us. The simple truth of her statement encompassed all they had built together, not just the physical structures that composed their homestead, but the shared life they had crafted with equal care. The twister that had destroyed everything Nora valued had ultimately delivered what neither she nor Tucker had known. They were seeking a partnership founded on resilience and mutual respect, growing into a love that weathered each new challenge with the same strength they had applied to rebuilding from destruction. As the autumn sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across their flourishing homestead, Nora offered silent gratitude for the storm that had seemed like ending, but had instead been Genesis. From chaos had come order, from loss had come abundance, from two solitary individuals had come family and community connection neither had imagined possible. The house Tucker Hayes had built with his own 2 hands stood as testament not just to skill and determination, but to the transformative power of helping others in their moments of greatest need. What had begun as simple human decency, stopping to assist when disaster struck, had evolved into a shared life of purpose and deepening love, proving that sometimes the strongest foundations are built not despite destruction, but because of the opportunities it creates for beginning anew.